Okay, the recording started. So hello everybody officially and welcome to the new Nordic-RSE seminar series session. So in case you are here for the first time, let's just have a quick overview of what this means. So I'm pasting now in the chat the link to this HackMD, which is what we will be using today for asking questions, commenting, and general information. I have now pasted the link in the chat. And so Nordic-RSE is this association to bring together and support research software engineers operating in the Nordics. It was officially registered this autumn. And if you are interested in knowing more about Nordic-RSE, you can visit the Nordic-RSE webpage. And you can see what kind of events it organizes. For example, we have weekly coffee breaks every Thursday morning, European time. And every 2 weeks, we have community meetings to plan cooler things and discuss cooler things. And one activity that we also have is this seminar series, which so far has been once a month. And if you're interested in this seminar series and you would like to give a talk, then you're very welcome. If you think you have an interesting topic, then it's most likely interesting. So you can, for example, chat on the Code Refinery Zulip chat to discuss the topic, or directly open an issue in the Nordic-RSE repository. There's an issue template for that to propose a topic. And if you would like to also watch previous talks, you can find them in the Nordic-RSE YouTube channel. So all the talks are available in the Nordic-RSE YouTube channel. Yeah. And our speaker today is Logan Kilpatrick. So he's developer community advocate in the Julia programming language, and also board member in the NUM Focus, which is famous for sponsoring a lot of big open source projects like NumPy, Julia, Jump. And today Logan will talk about the role and importance of community in open source projects. And if you have questions for the speaker, you can either ask directly, unmute and ask, or you can write them at the bottom of the HackMD. So by clicking this pencil here in the top left, you can enter edit mode and you can add questions. So yes, that being said, Logan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luca. This will hopefully be fun, and I'll say feel free to interrupt if there's questions. Also, feel free to put it. There's a Zoom chat into the HackMD, whatever is easiest. I'll try to keep an eye on all the different sources. So again, feel free to jump in, ask questions, and let me share screen really quick. Luca, just to confirm, everyone can see everything okay? Awesome. I see the heads nodding.
Yep, I can.
Wonderful.
See the screen.
Sweet. So let's dive in and talk about all the exciting stuff, which is, really the importance of open source and the importance of specifically community within the open source sort of ecosystem. So I always like to start off with this quote, which is that there is more to open source than code. And I think this is such a huge thing. A lot of the times we all potentially as developers sort of get caught up in, making contributions, code contributions, and all those sorts of things. But really sort of open source is more than that, just the code that's in a repository. I like this, which is this quote, which is just that open source is about people. I think there's sort of the project itself, but really when you sort of boil everything else away, it's really about the people that are there. If the people weren't there, the project wouldn't be what it is. So again, I like to really frame open source through this context of people rather than code and repositories and things like that. But this sort of, again, more broadly, there's a bunch of different aspects that I'll talk about today, one of which is just highlighting some of the realities of open source, which one of the realities is that there's a lot more to do in the open source ecosystem than just contribute code. And we'll talk about some of those things. Also talk about sort of if you want to get people to do those things, which aren't just traditional code contributions, what are some of the ways that we can actually go about getting folks to make those contributions? And then last, I'll show some examples of some of the actual ways that you can go about getting folks involved in those different capacities. So let's dive in and look at some of the different ways in which folks can contribute to open source. And I sort of just have this as a super general overview, but really, I think the strength of open source is that there's all of these different pieces that are involved. And some of them highlighted here are, the communication and the sort of the chat and the question and answering platforms, which are Stack Overflow, Discourse. If you're doing something like Slack and Zulip, all those things are sort of a key part of the open source community and ecosystem, in addition to the actual code project that's being worked on. You have all the social media stuff, which is sort of, again, how folks can sort of interact and communicate about open source. So I think, again, all of these are really important, and you can, with pretty minimal effort, make it so that all of those things are a really core part of the open source community that you're part of. And also that there's actual work that can be done in those areas to support people and give an opportunity to actually make a contribution. So I think it's really important to call that out. And then again, when we talk about sort of what it means to contribute to open source, one of the things that I really like to think about is this arc of being a contributor in the open source ecosystem. And it really starts off with something as simple as just having a conversation about open source. And that doesn't have to be in person. It can be just messaging people on a chat forum or something like that. And then potentially taking the next step, which might be opening an issue as you try to do something. And then maybe, writing a blog post or something of that nature, doing a documentation improvement. And then the final step, again, of this arc of being a contributor really is that code contribution. And I think, again, one of the challenges in open source is that I think maybe not us, but I think the idea is perpetuated that if you want to contribute to open source, the first thing that you have to do is jump into some code repository, make a code contribution, go and do some really crazy, differential equation stuff. And I think the reality is that's just so not true. And oftentimes the pathway that folks get to that, to the pathway that folks take to get to that code contribution is doing all these things, is taking all these intermediate steps. And sure that there's exceptions to this, and I'm sure some people don't sort of go down this route. But I think calling this out is super important so that folks who potentially aren't comfortable enough yet to make that final code contribution still have something that they can do. And there's a community in place, the sort of community mechanisms in place to reward those people, give those people feedback, make them feel acknowledged that they're doing all three of those things, which are super important in the open source community, but aren't an actual code contribution. It's not showing up on GitHub, all that sort of stuff. So that's, this is one of my favorite slides, just because I think this is one of the most important ideas. And if nothing else, just making sure that you're sort of reinforcing, you have the right reinforcing mechanisms in place for those first three steps, I think is super important. And all of those are sort of culminating around this notion that the open source community is at the center of these pieces. I think if you sort of take out the code contributions, or you take out the discussions or the sort of documentation or the issues, you remove any one of those pieces and you sort of lose this symbiotic relationship between all four components. So really, again, you need those four pieces in place in order for the open source community to actually exist and be there and work as you would expect it to. Another piece that I wanted to mention really quick is that it's also when you're sort of interacting in these open source communities, I think it's really important to mention to folks that, actually being a programmer isn't the only role that's available in the open source space. I think potentially my role previously as the community manager, now as a developer community advocate, is perhaps a good example of this. I think there's elements of the role that I have right now where I do program and things like I make contributions to open source projects, but that's really not the focus of the work that I do. And again, I think especially in like technical communities, there's all these implicit hierarchies and things like that. And I think there's a lot of focus on, hey, if I'm in the open source community, I need to be making code contributions. And like that has to be the thing that I'm doing in order to be a part of this community. And again, it's the burden is on folks who are in communities who want to attract people who aren't making those code contributions to actually go out and say, hey, we actually need people who aren't just going to make code contributions, but are also going to do all these other things that are really important to help the community. So this is something that whenever I'm speaking with folks, even like especially students now, just mentioning this to them, like, hey, you don't need to be a programmer, you could be a product manager. And I think those sort of things can really be lacking in open source projects, like just taking a product view at the actual code base or something like that. Don't need to write any code, but that can be really important. Or UX UI design is a huge thing. I think we don't do any UX UI design in the Julia project, for example. There's no sort of research studies investigating the effectiveness of our documentation or anything like that. And I think it's definitely something that we need, but those sort of folks, I think, have really been traditionally sort of excluded in some ways from the open source community because they're not making sort of core code contributions. So they show up and they're like, well, there's really nothing for me to do here. Why would I hang out and make these contributions? And then they go and move on and do something else. So again, the burden is on us to make it so that those people feel like there's actual work to happen. So it's something to think about. Another sort of question that we'll segue into is just around, okay, let's say that you want these non-code contributions. How can they actually be helpful? And I think this might be sort of obvious in a lot of ways, but again, worth mentioning and reiterating in case there's any points that aren't clear. But I think a lot of these non-code contributions, when you're sort of presenting these to someone saying, hey, this is maybe something that you should consider doing, these are really the three pieces that I really like to bring up with folks. And I think these three pieces are exceptionally important because a lot of the skills that you see here are things that really, in my opinion, make the difference between like great developers and just like an average programmer. The ability to communicate, the ability to sort of build bridges in sort of a technical community, and also broaden your scope beyond just being somebody who makes code contributions. I think these three things can really, again, be the differentiator, and the softer skills are oftentimes super important in this context. All right, so we talked a lot about why this is important, what some of the different things that we might want to consider, the high level stuff, but how can we actually sort of start to build these opportunities for folks to really make open source non-technical contributions? So there's a couple of different things that I want to talk about with respect to this. We'll talk about sort of from a project's perspective, how to sort of set things up correctly so that people want to make these contributions. But then we'll also talk about from an individual's perspective, like if you're an individual who wants to make these contributions, what are some of the different ways that you can go about making them? So I just highlighted three different things here. One of which is you can sort of just go out and do this. You don't really need anyone's permission. This is what I think is so cool about the open source community. If you want to go and write a bunch of really interesting blog posts about Julia, you don't need anyone's permission for that. Go and do it. Write the articles, share with people in the community. If it provides value, people will give you that feedback. They'll say, hey, this was awesome. We really appreciated it. We're super interested in you writing another one of these blog posts. I see people do this all the time. I send them that message all the time, that I'm grateful for all the interesting stuff that they're writing about. So that's really the permissionless approach. And I think it's what makes open source really cool. There's also, again, a lot of these things that, like if you're going to do something like a UX UI design study, that's really where you want to reach out to people, where you want to talk to the people who are in the community and sort of get them to buy into the project. This is one of the sort of hard lessons I've learned in the last few years in the open source community, which is if you want to do anything that sort of affects the structural level of a code base or of an open source project, you really need people to buy into that idea. Like it doesn't matter how enthusiastic you are. Like if I wanted to do some sort of design study on the Julia documentation, I really need a lot of core developers to sort of be on board with that, because it's again, potentially a really impactful project. So that's really where leveraging relationships, all that sort of stuff comes into play. And the nice part is if you've made these other contributions, it's really easy for folks to be like, oh yeah, I know so-and-so because they wrote that really great blog post, or they made this, documentation improvement, which was super helpful, or this code contribution. So yeah, let's totally run with this. They're doing a great job. Don't want to stop them from doing that work. It's really about sort of that arc of contributing helps you when you get to the point where you want to do something that's a little bit more ambitious, and you need help from maintainers or other contributors. You sort of have that track record of success in making contributions, so folks are much more likely to go out of their way to actually help you. Again, all of this is to say that these non-code contributions oftentimes end up being sort of filling the gaps in the community. And this is really how I see my role today. I spend a lot of time just observing what people are working on in the open source Julia community, seeing where there's gaps, seeing where there's an opportunity to do something really impactful that people are just bandwidth constrained and don't have the ability to spend the time to do whatever the project is. And if it's something that, again, I have the bandwidth to do, jumping in, doing that work so that the sort of community as a whole can continue to push forward. I think, again, there's a lot of opportunities for people to take the permissionless approach and just observe, be in the community, be in the open source community, see what's happening. And when those opportunities come up, jump in, fill the gap, and people will, again, reward you for that work, which I think is awesome. Before we push forward, I just want to pause for a second. Any questions, thoughts, controversies that have come up that folks want to mention? If not, then we will keep pushing forward.
I think your slide about the workflow, how to start contributing, it was pretty cool because I never thought about it, but it's actually perfectly nailed how I got involved in Julia intervals and in Julia. Like each step was exactly that. I started asking questions, then I started opening issues, then writing documentations, and then coding. So actually nailed each and every step in that order. So it was pretty cool to see it.
I love it. I'm glad that and you know what, again, I think there's people who don't go through that. And that's really the anomaly in my perspective. I think it's a very traditional path to go through all those steps. So I'm glad that that's what you went through as well. Awesome. Let's push forward. So next, we'll just talk for a moment about from an organization standpoint, from an actual open source project standpoint, what are some of the ways that, again, we can reinforce all the behaviors we want? Hopefully, the takeaway so far has been we want people to make these type of contributions that, again, aren't 100% technical code base in nature. So what are some of the different ways that we can sort of reinforce and get some of these contributions to actually happen? So there's a bunch of different things that we have tried to do within the Julia project. One of them is this contributor guide, which we'll actually look at a picture of, or you can go to julialang.org/contribute, and that has the full contributor guide. But this was really inspired by work that I saw our Openside community doing, and they did a really excellent job, again, of just taking the time to spell out all the different ways. Like, I get so many messages every day from random people on the internet who are like, hey, I want to contribute to the Julia project. I want to contribute to the Julia ecosystem. How do I do that? And I think the challenge that you have with, and this is really my biggest gripe right now in the open source community, is that if you go look at a contributing guide for most open source projects, large or small, it's really talking about sort of the mechanics of how you make a contribution, not what the areas where you can contribute are. It doesn't like highlight, here are the different things that we need help with. Here are the areas where, where the most impact could be had. They're all talking about, okay, here's how to open an issue. Here's how to do a pull request. Here are all of our conventions for making contributions. But still, if I just send someone to a random project they've never seen before, it's very unclear what they can, what are the actionable steps that they can take in order to be a contributor of that project. And that's really why we wrote the contributor guide at julialang.org/contribute, really as sort of an ecosystem-wide place where, regardless of the background that you had, you could go there and see something that you were comfortable doing and could start in that contribution pathway. And it doesn't have everything, and it doesn't, it's not perfect. There's still more that can be done, but the idea is someone can scan through that page really quickly and say, okay, I can do that. There's a bunch of things I can't do, but there's this one thing that I want to contribute. I'm going to go and do that thing right now. And then hopefully that sort of starts the snowball effect of that person becoming more involved in the community over time. And again, I think that the R Openside community has done an incredible job of this. And it's really just about explicitly saying a lot of these things, like the text the R Openside community has, I think does a really nice job of this by just saying, we welcome non-code and code contributions alike. They say things like, maybe you only want to spend a few minutes. Maybe you have 5 hours on a Saturday and you're looking to really bang out something that's more robust. Like really just calling out these different avenues of contributing, as well as the time requirements that you would need in order to make one of these contributions. I think these are all such awesome and important things that 99% of open source projects miss the boat on. No one, I've never seen, at least when I look at a contributing guide, I've never seen somebody say, here's, do you have 30 minutes? Here's something you could do. Do you have an hour? Here's something you can do. And I think for a new contributor, like that's the most important thing, or even a seasoned contributor. I sometimes look at projects and it's really hard for me to know, like, okay, this technical, like something that I want to do is in the Julia package manager. When you add a package, I want it to like show the actual GitHub URL or GitLab URL of that package. And the reason that I actually haven't dove in and started developing yet is because I'm really unclear, how long is that contribution actually going to take? Is that like a 6-hour contribution, or can I knock that out in like 20 minutes? So it's been on the back burner for a long time now. And I think, again, if open source projects did a better job of just providing a general estimate, I think it could really make a big difference for folks between making that contribution and not making that contribution. So something to think about. The R Openside contributing documentation is great. I'll pull up another example of it in a sec. Let's see if I actually want to switch over to actually looking at our Openside contributing. Let's take a look at the R Openside contributing guide. So this page is really what sort of hits the point home for me. They do a great job of sort of prefixing this with what brings you here. I want to, and then they have all these different things. I want to browse packages, subscribe to the newsletter, read the developer guide, learn about how to be part of the community, meet the people who are part of the R Openside community, attending, basically like all of the steps and the things that you would need to be a healthy, productive member of this open source community, they're all here. There's nothing that's sort of hidden somewhere else that you would need to go find in order to really be part of this community. They've really done a good job of documenting all of it and making it so that if you want to join and you want to take these first steps, the things that you need are here. And they have the learning section. Let's just see if they have the build here. They have all the contributing things like, reporting bugs, volunteering to review a package, all of these things. I think this is incredible. I think this is awesome. I think that our Julia version of this still has, and I'll pull it up just in case folks didn't see it. Nope, not the wrong link. This one. So I think we have a lot more work that we need to do on this site, on this page, in order to make it as robust as the R Openside version. But I think we do have some of the things, hopefully, that will, again, from a code contribution, we document a lot of the different things. et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully this is sort of a step in the right direction, but we still have more work that needs to be done with this guide. Yeah, and this is just a page. So this again sort of highlights all the high level points that I wanted to make. I know we're only at 30 minutes, but hopefully this was helpful and useful. I really think that there's a huge opportunity for folks to bring in more contributors, and at NumFocus, this is a huge thing that we look at when we think about open source projects that we're actually letting in to join NumFocus. Really, there's a lot of eyeballs on the contributing guide, and right now it's something that's more of a box checker. Do projects have this open source contributing guide? But again, I really think that there's such an opportunity to push the contributing guide forward. And at NumFocus, we're spinning up a project incubator, which will hopefully take open source projects that want to be part of NumFocus. They need that sort of institutional infrastructure and provide them with the resources to grow as an open source project so that they can become part of NumFocus, but also sort of develop in all the ways that you would want to as a healthy project. And one of the specific things that we're looking at in that incubator is helping folks develop their contributing guide so that they can actually attract contributors regardless of the sort of the contribution mechanism that folks want to participate through. So I'm really excited about this. Happy to answer any questions that folks have. Otherwise, feel free to ping me offline if there's a contributing guide in your specific domain or package or the like that you need help with. Always happy to bounce ideas around and make those a little bit more robust. But that's all I've got.
Yeah, thank you very much, Logan. Let's give the speaker a virtual round of applause. And yeah, do we have any questions or comments in the audience? Yeah, Kabe.
Thanks, Logan. It was actually very interesting. I have a quick question. Can you talk a bit about challenges of moderating a community, especially when it comes to like resolving conflicts or, managing or handling unruly behaviors and stuff like that?
Yeah, so I think I'm grateful enough to be in the position where the Julia community actually has a bunch of folks who have been doing this for a really long time. I find it extremely difficult. I think Matt Bauman, Stefan, a few other folks, specifically on discourse, is where most of the moderation happens. And I think they do an incredible job of being sort of level-handed in the way that moderation happens, but it's really difficult. I think we could probably have an entire different conversation about moderation and sort of those best practices. And I think getting some more folks involved in that conversation would be great. But in general, the most difficult part, in my opinion, is these borderline cases where folks aren't, like, it's really easy to stop like spam and just like truly like aggressive, rude behavior. But it's like the things where people are like talking about some technical topic and they're just like, casually dropping in all these like rude slights to the other people in the conversation. Like those are really the most tricky. And I see those most commonly, like people are arguing about some technical topic, but they're not just like, and they're normal people who are part of the community, and they're making it really difficult to do level-headed moderation, because ideally you wouldn't want that to be part of the conversation, but it can be really hard to figure out like, who do I stop? Do you just close down the whole thread? All those things. So yeah, it's difficult, and we should definitely have another conversation just about moderation stuff.
Thank you. Abel, please go ahead.
Hi, Logan. Thanks for the talk. My question is about recognition of other contributions. So if someone contributes part of a code, you can, for instance, add them to the authors list, depending on how you do those things. But Do you, Julia, Nonfocus, or you personally have any opinion on or mechanics on how to deal with other kind of contribution?
Yeah, that's a great question. One point that I'll make just in general is, and you can actually see it right here, really good book by an author named Jono Bacon. And Jono used to be the director of communities at GitHub. He did a bunch of stuff at, I think it was Canonical or Ubuntu, one of the Linux operating systems. So he's really great. And the book is called People Powered, and he spends a lot of time talking about sort of the mechanisms to reward people. I think the challenge in open source is that a lot of the sort of mechanisms that you would want to reward people with require money and time and organization and all these things, which are sorely lacking in the open source space. So ideally, I would want to send people stickers and T-shirts and all that sort of stuff, and I unfortunately don't get to do that. So it's really sort of making use of what the resources you have available to you are. I think today, for example, I put out a tweet on the Julia Twitter, celebrating that we had 10,000 questions on Stack Overflow, and specifically calling out Bogomil and I don't want to butcher the other person's name, but I like to think of him as Bogomil's partner in crime. Starts with a P, Prizets, something like that. I apologize, I can't say it. But really, again, just acknowledging them publicly for the work that they do, because the reality is they, as a duo on Stack Overflow, answer 20% of all Julia questions on Stack Overflow, which is huge. It's massive. So those sort of things I can do. They don't cost us any money. It's just a tweet, but I hope that sort of gives them the gratification and thanks them for the hard work that they're doing. So it really depends. And again, it's really difficult, but trying to figure out, again, for your specific community, what the mechanisms you have available to you are. If you have money, life becomes very easy. If you don't have money, you have to get more creative and sort of figure it out.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I also think in Jono's book, he does a nice job of illustrating, sort of like I was talking about the arc of being a contributor. He does a nice job of illustrating. It's really this sort of this like staircase. As you go up, as you continue to make more contributions, you lose people in the sort of funnel to get to the top of being like a maintainer of a project. You continue to lose people, but also as you go up, the sort of incentive mechanism has to change for each, when you're just a sort of a casual drive-by contributor versus being like a core maintainer. Those mechanisms have to change as you go up. You can't just, like, technically maybe a tweet for Bogomil because he's such a pivotal part of the community isn't the actual right incentive mechanism. Like, he needs something else. And again, I don't have enough time to be strategic about what that is. But ideally, you would actually want to figure out, sort of, for somebody who's more established, maybe it is a t-shirt, or maybe it's like a plaque or something like that. I don't know what it is, but being strategic about how you do those incentives for people who are at different points in their sort of journey in the community, I think is really important.
Thank you. We have other questions from the audience.
Those are both excellent questions.
I was wondering, when you talked about like attracting more like non-coding contributions, like, do you see as a challenge that like, you know, as like, for example, Julia is mainly, like, I would say, thought as like scientific computing language, and mainly like praised and advertised in more tech or science communities, where, for example, people, more artistic people who would like greatly improve the aesthetic and the usability of the documentation don't generally hang out. So how would you try to reach those people who could more benefit? Do you see as a challenge that at the moment we are kind of, as it said in Italian, raining or where it's already wet? So like advertising tech in tech fields, and hence not getting people who could help this more soft non-coding part. And how would you tackle this problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a bunch of different parts of that. I think one of the things is, yes, I think the Julia community it's a challenge that the sort of marketing, if you will, I think marketing might not be the positioning of Julia as a language is really delicate, because you sort of want yourself to be distinct from these other languages. Like we want to say, oh, Julia is the language for science, and that's sort of our niche, because you sort of need that niche to grow and to compete. But also you also in general want everybody to learn Julia. So you can't focus too much on the niche, but you also have to have a niche. So finding the balance between these two things where, are we sort of supplemental to a language like Python? Do we replace a language like Python? A lot of question marks around that. In general, I think one of the focuses that I have is trying to get folks who don't potentially have just that scientific background into the Julia ecosystem. And one of the ways that I've done this is looking at some of the other domains where interesting Julia stuff is happening, like Genie.jl, for example, web development stuff. I wrote an article the other day about how to do web development in Julia for a platform called Free Code Camp, and hopefully things like that. Folks who are potentially doing web development in some other ecosystem like Python using Django, for example, might see that post and be like, oh, what is Julia? I've never heard of this. And oh, you can also do all this interesting scientific stuff, but you can actually do some cool web development work as well. So hopefully things like that, sort of broadening the scope of what Julia can be used for, is really important. As far as how to get in front of folks who sort of aren't part of those technical communities at all, I think that's probably more of a challenge, like designers and artists and things like that. I'm just not sort of privy to those communities. So I would probably need to, again, be a little bit more strategic about how that happens. Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure that I have a good answer, or that I've really done a lot of work trying to make those folks come over into the Julia community. I think in general, though, the framework that I approach a lot of these things through is emphasizing the impact that work in the Julia community can have, which is something that I get, again, super excited about. Like that's the reason I love making contributions in the Julia community, is because basically if you don't make the contribution, it might not happen. And I think for me, that's really exciting. Like in the Python community, I'm like, I could go make this PR, but next week someone else will probably make it if I don't, just because there's so many people and the community is so large. And I don't feel that way about the Julia community. Like, again, if I don't go and make this PR right now, it might never happen. And I think that can be really impactful for whoever you are, regardless of what the contribution is. So that's always the point that I try to make for folks. And that's probably what I would say to somebody who's a designer or an artist. Hey, you can make this really impactful contribution that unless you're doing it for like python.org or whatever the Python website is, you might not get the same level of exposure or impact or something like that.
Yes. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Answer. Yeah. Do we have other questions from the audience or comments?
If not, no worries. Again, as I said before, feel free to ping me offline if you want to sort of start building out a contributing guide for whatever your specific community is. Always happy to help bounce ideas around. Feel free to take whatever you like from the Julia version of this. I think for the most part, we might have started with a copy and paste of the Openside one, and then sort of iterating on that as time went on. So feel free to do the same thing, copy and paste what we have, and sort of build off of that if that's of any value to you. And again, always happy to answer more questions offline. But this was great. I'm glad we got a chance to chat about things.
Yeah. Okay, so there doesn't seem to be further questions, so we can maybe thank Logan again with a virtual round of applause. And yeah, so I guess I can now stop the recording.